Boyd, Executive Director of the ARC Michigan.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank everyone for attending today. We really appreciate your participation in our public policy seminar over GoToWebinar this month. This is replacing our in-person seminar that we usually have at the end of June. This is the second of 4 sessions we are doing on public policy issues in Michigan and at the federal level. Today, we will be hearing from Mark McWilliams and Noah Walker from Michigan Protection and Advocacy Services, and they're going to be talking about voting. I just want to make one last comment. We're in the middle of our governmental affairs appeal here at the ARC Michigan, and if you feel compelled, please consider donating to our efforts to continue to work on public policy here for people on behalf of families and people with developmental disabilities in Michigan. Any little bit of amount can help as we continue forward. We're doing our work here at the ARC Michigan. Again, thank you for attending, and I want to turn it over to Mark McWilliams and Noah Walker from Michigan and Protection Advocacy Services. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all well and safe and ready to enjoy the summer. My name is Mark McWilliams. I am the Director of Public Policy and Media Relations at Michigan Protection and Advocacy Service. I'm trying my work clothes back on, getting back into being in our offices. And I want to give Noah Walker a chance to also introduce himself.
Yes, my name is Noah Walker, and I'm kind of like now the, I think beforehand I used to be called like the voter outreach specialist, but now Mark wants me to become like the voter engagement specialist. Whatever works is fine. So I'm going to be sort of like presenting in the middle of the webinar. So hopefully you'll find this very useful. And pretty much look into our website and into kind of like our voting initiatives when it's finally updated. Right now, there's kind of like a website change with now we're going to be turned into Disability Rights Michigan. So that's coming up in the near future.
So thanks, Noah. I see a lot of familiar names on the list. So let me. Most of you probably know what services we provide, but let me go over those for those of you who may not know. We are the designated protection and advocacy organization covering the state of Michigan. We are mandated under federal and state law to advocate for people with disabilities. There's an organization like ours in every state and in every territory, including a protection and advocacy agency serving Native American community, District of Columbia, and a number of U.S. territories. So no matter where you are, you can get one. We are funded by 9 federal programs, different grants. The original grant that we are funded under is the Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Developmental Disabilities. Since the mid-1970s, that's how the protection and advocacy system was started. Since then, we have added programs to serve people with mental illness, serve people with traumatic brain injury, serve people in search of assistive technology, serve people in among other things. Our most recent one is we do monitoring of people who have Social Security representative payees in cases that are assigned to us by the Social Security Administration. One of the grants that we have is Protection and Advocacy for Voter Access, where we provide voter engagement and advocacy to improve access to voting. The services that we provide are free, they're confidential. If one of the things we do is we provide information and referral assistance to anybody who has a question about disability-related issues. That service has been live. That is, you can contact us during the day and you'll get to talk with someone. Up until the pandemic forced us to go to remote operations, we're going to be reopening our live service on Monday. So if you have questions, the service will be available from 9 to 1 and from 2 to 4 during the weekday. You can also contact us through our website address. You will, just so you know, be redirected to a temporary site. So don't be worried if that happens. We were putting that site up. I think it's going up today. But we've had some trouble with our old website, and we'll be switching over to a more permanent one in the summer. But you will be redirected to a temporary site where you can get information, including for those of you who are on the, those of you who use our Special Education Advocates Manual, you'll have access to that, and a lot of other information. And you can also use the portal from that website to request assistance or submit an information and referral question to us. So next slide, please. So some of the things that we do in the area of voter outreach, and I'll have to retitle this because we're talking now more about a more inclusive term called voter engagement, is that we try to identify and address voting barriers that people with disabilities are subjected to. We work with clerks, we work with the state, other voting rights advocates to try to improve access to registration, including access to voting. And we also provide some education and support for people with disabilities on not only their voting rights, but also on how to use nonpartisan strategies to improve their knowledge about the voting system and about issues that are facing people with disabilities in elections. That's a tricky business to do in a nonpartisan way, but we do our best to try to give people tools that they can use to become more informed about elections and election issues, and so people feel more comfortable about voting. Next slide, please. So our basic message is that people with disabilities, just like anyone else, have the right to vote, and they have the right to vote their conscience. And that includes the right to accessible voting, it includes the right to private voting, and as best as we can try to ensure those things. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So let me give you just a real quick rundown of why, the history of voting and why it's important. There was a case called Westbury versus Sanders, which is a fair civil rights voting case where the U.S. Supreme Court concluded no right's more precious in a free country than that of having a voice in the election of those who make the laws under which we must live. Certainly, as people with disabilities, that voting right is just as important for them as it is for anyone else. In some ways, maybe even more important because of the history of marginalization and exclusion that people with disabilities have been subjected to. Next slide, please. So there are constitutional protections. The U.S. Constitution, that is in the 26th Amendment. That, for those of you, I'm not going to ask you to date yourselves, but for those of you who remember when the right to vote for 18-year-olds was established, it wasn't that long ago. Well, I guess it was now. The right of citizens who are 18 years of age or older shall not be abridged by the U.S. or any state on account of age. So that means that nobody can restrict that in the 26th Amendment. That's also reflected in Article 2, Section 1 of the Michigan Constitution. So those are both federal and state rights that are constitutional. Next, please. So in addition to the constitutional protections, there are also federal and state laws that protect people's right to vote. And the Americans with Disabilities Act in particular protects and assures the right to vote in federal law as a federal statute. Not only does it talk about the right federally, but it also requires state and local governments to ensure that people with disabilities have that access to voting. There are lots of different kinds of elections, and often in the law they're treated differently. There are federal elections where you vote for president, vice president, members of Congress, senators, And then there are state elections where you also vote for state officials, your state legislators, and a whole host of other people, judges, Supreme Court justices, local officials, the Secretary of State, the State Attorney General. So there are federal elections and state elections, and what's broad about the Americans with Disabilities Act is it assures that people with disabilities have those rights to be assured by state and local governments as well as the federal government. And I've given you, there's a resource there that you can access, the Department of Justice, talking about the rights of voters with disabilities under the ADA and other federal laws. Next, please. So it's not just about the physical act of voting. It also, the ADA applies to all aspects of voting. So from the time when you start making voter registration available, it affects the kinds of sites that are provided, and it applies to the casting of ballots. And that ballot casting process can be either on the day of the election, people voting in person on the day of the election, or in Michigan, you can actually vote. You can do absentee voting on the day of an election now, or you can do you can register and vote on the same day, or during any early voting process. Where in Michigan, of course, you have the opportunity to mail in absentee ballots, and in other states, in some states, there are opportunities to vote early early in person in some cases. Same source for that information. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, the Michigan Constitution also provides protections against restrictions on voting. The right to vote can't be impeded. There are a couple of exceptions. One's if a person is currently serving a prison term for a felony, they are not allowed to vote, and they should not be allowed to register to vote. But they can do that as soon as they are no longer serving their sentence. If they've finished their sentence, they're released, they're paroled, people can get that vote. The second sentence is a little misleading. It says that if the right's been removed by a judge. There is actually no statutory authority in Michigan for a judge to remove a person's ability to vote based on competency. And so even though the Constitution makes allowance for that, there is no provision in the state statutes that give judges the authority to do that. And that's an important guarantee, because it's not true in most states. Michigan's one of 9 states that does not restrict at all the ability of a person under a guardianship to vote. Most states provide some restriction based on a person having a guardian, and that's not something that happens in Michigan. So we found in doing trainings for people on right to vote that this is often a surprise to not only to individuals but to guardians as well. And so it's one of the things that we try to help people understand, that guardians don't have the power to tell a person you can't vote, you don't have the power to vote, you can't register to vote, etc. Next, please. So the section, the Article 2 of the Constitution in the state also assures the right to voter registration. They assure the right to a secret ballot, which is interesting considering that we are still struggling with how to do that on an absentee basis. And we'll talk more about that near the end of the presentation. And it ensures the right to do absentee voting. And there are additional changes that happened in 2018 that further assure that there is a right to absentee ballots, and spells out some individually some more specific protections. Next. And yet, with all these rights, more people check their Facebook page or watch the Super Bowl and vote. That's according to Rock the Vote, that is from 2017. There's a lot of research on the issues that people with disabilities have about getting access to the voting process and why. And for some of that information, I'm going to turn this over to Noah.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Next slide, please. So a 2017 study found that nearly 30 million potential voters have disabilities, and yet vote 6% less often and register 2% less often. So if people with disabilities voted and registered at around the same rate, there'd be 2.2 million additional voters. And this is saying at the same rate of people that don't have a disability at all. This is according to Rutgers University, the 2017 study. Next slide. The Rutgers update found that turnout rates varied by disability, and that turnout by employed adults with disabilities was equal to that of adults that don't have any reported disabilities at all. The 2014 survey said that one of the greatest barriers reported by voters was with disabilities, their own lack of education on candidates and issues. And that could be a real struggle for people who don't know what's going on in their community. It can range kind of like locally. If they don't really understand what's happening in their state and they don't have like any kind of like informational access, whether, you know, if they have a computer or not, trying to find alternative sources for that can be a real problem for people. So that's according to the 2014 survey, along with 2016, 2018 survey from Self-Advocates of Becoming Empowered. That's an organization that does a lot of like self-advocacy when it comes to voting. So go move on to the next slide.
Noah, can I just interject something here?
Sure.
For those of you who do employment advocacy, and I know there are some of you on the list, one of the benefits, one of the additional benefits to competitive integrated employment is that the survey information indicates that adults who are employed in the community competitively in integrated settings vote more often. It's another reason why competitive integrated employment is so important. Go ahead.
All right. So 2017 report found that only 40% of the sample polling places were accessible, and that's under the Government Accountability Office. Barriers include steep ramps that were steeper than an 8.3% gradient. That's kind of like the current guideline. If it's steeper than 8.3%, that means that it's not accessible. The lack of signage can be a real problem. If a person with disability doesn't really find a sign that clearly says, you know, accessible voting station right here, then they're going to be confused about where to go. The lack of parking has been, or limited parking for that matter, can be a real hassle. And this is like for a physical polling place. Right now, we don't have to worry too much of that because we're under a vote by mail state under Benson. So that's for this year in 2020. But when we're returning back to where we don't have COVID and we're not necessarily have to be strictly, you know, vote by mail, then that's going to be an issue. The improper placement of accessible voting stations has been a real problem in the past. There were a couple of people that we had to resolve where the accessible voting places were not at all accessible to people, whether they had like a wheelchair, whether they had sip and puff. So that has been a problem that we've been addressing for the past couple of years that I've been here. And even beforehand. So early voting systems sometimes are not accessible, even though the use by people with disabilities is increasing. So that can be something that is going to have to be fixed. Next slide. Some voters with disabilities had issues with filling out an absentee ballot. I would have to say that for 2020 of this year, there was a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of like a bunch of people who are visually impaired and blind, saying that it was not all accessible for people who were visually impaired. And the Secretary of State decided to endorse the idea of UOCAVA, which is an electronic ballot delivery system that military and overseas voters use. And that was held not just in May 5th, but also in August and November. Getting transportation to the polls when we're talking about more of like physical polling places, that has been a problem, whether someone is registered to live in Detroit or in rural areas that you know, we were built by the automobiles. So if we don't have driver's licenses, moving to public transportation, that could be a real problem within the state of Michigan in particular. Casting a private ballot has been kind of like a normal complaint. You do have a right to get help from two party officials, but you know, the thing is that you also have a right to vote privately and independently. So that's something that is under the Help America Vote Act. And unfortunately, there have been some people that with disabilities that had trouble casting for whatever reason. And one of the reasons is that they had trouble with the voting equipment that was in the place. And we've been on the ball trying to resolve these issues since I've been here and even beforehand. Navigating the polls in wheelchairs can be tricky, especially if the doors are not greater than 32 inches. And I've heard from one person who I've known personally that his wheelchair is greater than 32 inches. So that was something where I was in Detroit at the Disability Network there, and he said that was an actual issue for him. So and that was good to know. Getting fair treatment by poll workers can be a challenge. If someone is saying move the line, and then also like it doesn't really seem like you have a disability, you know, like they're just sort of like assuming who has a disability versus who doesn't, which is really a bad way to go about being a poll worker. If you're a poll worker and do that, then don't do that again. I mean, that's just disrespectful. I wouldn't tolerate that. Next slide. Under the 2018 SAVE report, most of the barriers to voting were physical. So that meant that the doors were not wide enough. There were trouble with people with disabilities getting the ramps sometimes. That means including you know, steps, like multiple steps to get to the voting booth. So that's been a problem. So 16% had trouble with the doors being wide enough. 10% had problems with the voting machines not working correctly. That was in our case, and then also in our case, the voting booths were not private. And come 2020, we're going to be more active with SAVE, actually handing out surveys so that we get more of a real feel for the entire state. Beforehand, we were just sort of like surveying our entire office. So that's going to come up later. Just FYI. While 61% of voters surveyed under the SAFE report voted independently, if you're a new voter and if you don't really know what the process is, then you can kind of see why 46% of new voters were able to vote independently. And that's for people with disabilities. Next slide. Rights about voter accessibility will include registration. It will include parking, physical access, alternative marking devices. And, that would mean like if someone wants to flip a pop or some other audiovisual aid, it's got to be available. Privacy and independence when voting, as I said before, but that's under HAVA. And then absentee ballots, you do have a right to have an absentee ballot. And now in Michigan, you don't have to provide a reason for it, for actually having an absentee ballot. And of course, the current president wants to fight that, but that's a whole different discussion. You do have a right to get help from others, and that's pretty much the slide. So next slide. So I gotta be honest with you that the link there is a YouTube link. So if for this entire video of at the polls, and if we can't do that, then it looks like I can't access the link, unfortunately. Could someone click it?
So we're going to try to play this. Let's see if we can get the sound to work. If
Yeah.
not, we'll give you the link so you can go on YouTube and watch it yourself. This is one of a series that was just released this spring.
Yeah, I don't think the sound is going on right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Never mind. I'll send you the link.
So, and we'll post that in the chat box as well.
Sure. And it looks like it's already being sent out. So thank you to the ARC and Courtney Trump for that. Next slide. So access resources include the U.S. Department of Justice guides. Now, the U.S. Department of Justice, I would say it would take years to get any kind of case resolved at this point. It takes longer than how I would normally want to. So the American Association of People with Disabilities Voter Resource Center kind of shows you kind of like your rights to vote. And one thing that I also really like about the American Association of People with Disabilities is that they really do focus on the issues as well. So if you want to get like a real education of like what's actually impacting people with disabilities, then that's something to kind of like look into on their own website. And then for the election protection hotline, it is if I can find it.
No, the number is on the next slide.
Yeah. So yeah, next slide. It's 1-866-687-8683, and they're the organization that provides immediate services to those who have trouble voting or have been denied the right to vote. And normally, if they start to refer to us, then then we're going to have to look into the issue and then contact the clerk to make sure that the poll workers are doing their job the next time. And that's like when your voting rights have been denied. Next slide. So again, if your voting rights have been denied, that's something where you should contact us. And then if you're experiencing any kind of like voter intimidation or suppression, then and recently I think the better word is suppression anyway, then you should contact us. If your polling place is not at all accessible, meaning that not just like the physical access of it, but also like the voting machines, then you should contact us. For absentee balloting, I would say that if you're having trouble with either reading print or you know, like writing a signature, then you should contact us. If the technology at all is like not accessible for whatever reason, then you should contact us as well. And I think that's all I have to say. I think Mark's next.
So go ahead, next slide, please. One thing that I just want to give you a heads up about is that next month, NOAA and the Self-Advocates of Michigan are doing joint web-based training for people with disabilities and anyone else who's interested on voter registration, issues about voting, how to deal with problems. And Noah, what's the third topic?
It's sort of like how to vote.
How to vote, right.
Yeah.
So we'll be doing a joint series with the Self-Advocates of Michigan using curriculum developed by Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered, their Go Voter project. So keep a lookout for that information. Those will be coming up starting in the early part of July. So let me give you sort of the update on policy issues and a little bit of update on litigation that's going on right now as well. The rights update, as you probably know, Proposal 3 was passed in 2018, and it enshrined in the Constitution and state law some specific rights for all voters. One of those rights was the right to do what is called straight ticket voting, where you can mark either Republican, Democratic, whatever parties that are on the ballot. You can mark that you vote for all the candidates in those areas. There is a provision for automatic registration if you update an ID card, state ID card or driver's license through the Secretary of State's office. You can do automatic voter registration that way. There is no reason absentee voting. Used to be before 2018, you had to give a reason for using an absentee ballot. One of the reasons was you had a disability that prevented you from going to the polls. But the law now is clear that there isn't a reason that's required. You don't have to justify why you're doing it. And there's also an assurance of same-day voter registration. That's a little bit trickier because after that provision was adopted by the voters in 2018, the legislature actually put some limitations on that same-day registration, saying that if you registered 14 days beforehand, that you could do that and then vote in the election. But if in between 14 days and the day of the election, you had to actually go to the clerk's office or to a place that the clerk designated to register, even if you wanted to vote the same day. And that creates a barrier for people with disabilities, especially if there are transportation issues, and you find that you have difficulty arranging transportation to one place. You actually find that you have to arrange transportation to two places, one to the clerk's office to register, the other to the polling place to vote. One way around that is to actually vote absentee at the clerk's office when you register on the same day. And then the trick is to make sure that that process is accessible to people with disabilities. So that is a little bit tricky, but it is enshrined in the law. Next, please. So let me give you an update on a little bit of an update on some litigation that we know about. And there's, of course, in the week or so since this was prepared and updated, there's more litigation happening. One of the areas of litigation that Noah touched on earlier in the presentation is over the accessibility of absentee ballots. Just to give you a real quick primer on how this process is supposed to work, clerks can choose to send out an application for absentee ballots, and if you can request one if you want one. You apply for an absentee ballot, you send it back to the Secretary of State or your clerk. The clerk sets you up with an absentee ballot and then sends the ballot to you before the election. One of the problems with that process is that it's all paper, and so if you're blind, you have issues about being able to use paper or manipulate a paper ballot. You're not able to actually complete that yourself. So board members of the state chapter of the National Federation for the Blind, and then later joined by the National Federation of the Blind itself, filed suit against the Secretary of State probably about a month or so ago. Actually, be more than that since it affected the May election. So it was actually back in April. Time flies. Filed suit saying you need to provide an accessible alternative to filling out this ballot. And the parties settled for the May election and then adopted a broader approach for the upcoming August and November elections. For the May election, the parties agreed that an electronic ballot delivery process that currently exists under state law under an act called the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Access to Voting Act, or UOCAVA, where military personnel and other people living overseas can electronically request that a ballot be electronically delivered to them. And then that gets you half the way. They then can fill out the ballot and then send it back in, and that process was used actually in the May election. It's also likely, according to the settlement, that that process will be used again in the August election. But then for the November election, the Secretary of State has agreed to adopt a broader electronic ballot delivery system so that anybody with a disability can request that their ballot be delivered electronically and that be done. That's following litigation that has happened in a number of other states, including Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, Colorado, and now New York has also joined the fray to require that electronic ballot delivery be available to people with disabilities. What that does not do, unfortunately, is it does not provide for electronic casting of ballots, where once you get the electronic ballot, you can use your assistive technology or fill it out in an electronic format and then send it back electronically. There are a couple of places and a couple of states that have piloted electronic ballot casting. It's the reason it's more controversial because election security experts, weighed in saying that it's very difficult to ensure election security when you start allowing people to electronically cast ballots. So those issues are more controversial. They're thornier. People are trying to work out those issues. But what should not be as controversial now is the concept that electronic ballot delivery is provided for people who need it. Another issue of litigation is the issue about when absentee ballots are postmarked. Usually, most of the rules say that in order for an absentee ballot to be counted, that it has to arrive at the polling place by election day. And so if the mail gets delayed or there's some other issue, then you mail your ballot and it gets there the day after election day, it's not going to be counted because it's too late. So there is litigation now pending that is trying to extend that timeline to require ballots that are postmarked by election day to be counted in the election. And that's, I think that litigation is still pending. There is now related litigation to that issue, and that is what happens when you request an absentee ballot and there's a delay, or an application for a ballot, and there's a delay in getting the application to you and processing the application so you actually get an absentee ballot. There's information about delays in actually processing applications and making sure that you get on to the voting list. And if you apply too late, then you can get an absentee. There are examples of people getting absentee ballots on the day of, on election day, and actually getting their ballot and then having to vote it the same day and get it to the polls the same day, which means that you essentially are robbed of the right to be able to use an absentee ballot. There is also litigation that's pending now on a number of what many people view as election suppression, voter suppression issues, consolidation of polls, where because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's getting harder to find poll workers. You run the risk of being exposed, and so it's been more difficult. Not as much we've not seen as many examples in Michigan. There were certainly major examples that happened in Wisconsin and more recently in Georgia, where consolidation of polls because of a lack of workers or for other reasons made it more difficult, not just for, you had to wait longer to vote. That can become an accommodation issue for people with disabilities who may have trouble waiting, may have trouble standing. So that can be an issue for people with disabilities.
Sorry, Mark, I want to interject. Another issue was also, like, particularly in Georgia, there was the closing of like African American precincts because people who were in the state, like the Secretary of State at the time, Frank Kemp, was worried about the fact that that it would violate, like having these precincts would violate the ADA. So they used the ADA to actually close those precincts, which obviously wasn't going to fly with the National Disability Rights Network and other disability rights organizations. They thought that was not really a valid reason to do any of that. And they felt like if there was any kind of reform, then you would actually have to open more precincts in order to make sure that those rights were met.
Right. So, thanks, Noah. The other area of litigation on the other side of this is that there's been a lot of controversy about the decision by the Secretary of State to automatically send out applications for absentee ballots to all registered voters. Before that happened, this was a county by county determination, and the Secretary of State has decided they're going to send out absentee ballot applications to everyone. Now, keep in mind, and I'll talk about this when we get to state legislation in a second, that right now under Michigan law, the application is election to election. So that when you send out an application for an absentee ballot, that it's for that election. There is something called a permanent absentee ballot, a permanent absentee voter list that clerks currently have discretion to maintain, and some clerks do that. There is legislation pending that would make that a requirement that all clerks keep that permanent absentee voter list in their precincts. So anyway, there is litigation now that has challenged the Secretary of State sending out the applications to everyone. It's not clear what's going to happen with that litigation, but it has been filed, and of course we'll see what happens with it, whether it stays in place or not. Probably will not be the last of the litigation that we see about voting in Michigan. Next slide. So just to give you a real quick update, because this is the policy conference, and you probably want to know about policy. There is, in the last count that I made on this last Friday, there were 44 bills in the state legislature dealing with voting. 9 of those bills were active. I'll just give you sort of a flavor of what some of those bills are, and some of them are moving along. Some of them are now moving along and are actually pretty close to being signed into law. There are 2 bills dealing with precinct sizes. Okay, one of them, HB 5031, and these are sponsored by Representative Bolin, Republican. 5031 expands the type of place that can be used as a polling place from purely public facilities to include also private facilities. The reasoning behind the law is that it's getting harder and harder in some instances to find public facilities that are accessible and open, especially schools. Given the pandemic, schools were hesitant to open themselves up to people from outside the school setting while they were still open, and now they won't be open until the fall. That bill has made some progress. It is out of the House Ways and Means Committee, now is on the House floor. 5032 is more controversial in that it, same sponsor, allows counties to basically expands the maximum number of people that can be in a precinct from 3,000 to 5,000. And it's controversial because there's a claim that it makes it hard, it increases waiting times, that it can be done selectively to disenfranchise certain groups of voters. It also doesn't apply to every election. It applies to everything except for the November election. Anyway, that bill is still in committee. It was actually reported out of the first House committee. For those of you not familiar with the process in the Michigan legislature, in the House, bills have to go through 2 committees before they get to up for a vote. One of them is the Basic Policy Committee, in this case House Elections, and then the second committee is the House Ways and Means Committee. There are a couple of committees that screen basically and have a second shot at voting on any particular bill. So HB 5032 has been voted out or reported from its original committee, but it is still pending in the Ways and Means Committee. And then the next step for that bill would be to move to the House floor for consideration. There are 2 bills, both Senate bills that are connected to each other, bipartisan bills, SB 117 and SB 297, which would allow, under the UO-CAVA process, would allow voters to return or cast their ballots electronically. Currently, as I talked about before, with absentee balloting, the state law provides for electronic ballot delivery, and people get the ballots. They then have to print them out, fill them out on paper, put them in an envelope, send them back. These bills would make it possible for people to actually file them electronically. Those bills are both pending. They are actually they passed the Senate. They are waiting action on the House floor. They were actually reported out by the House Elections Committee, reported out to the House floor. There are substitutes, and so those substitutes will have to be reconciled, but those bills are pending. There are a number of bills about counting of absentee ballots. So current state law requires people to, there are a couple of things it requires. One is that it requires that you count them. You can't start processing absentee ballots until election day. And the other is that you can't have people sort of rotating in and out on the count. Once you start, you keep on going. So as you can imagine, that makes for pretty long days at some of these precincts. And with the increase in the number of absentee ballots that people are casting, it makes it really, really hard for precincts to keep, for precincts and clerks to keep up. So these bills would put in some flexibility, would allow some pre-processing to happen. That is, they can open, verify some of the ballots and put them in a special box and start start a little bit earlier. And it also allows for shifts of people to to work on doing some of the counting. Those bills are less controversial. SB 756 has actually passed the Senate, passed 38-0. 757 is waiting for a vote in the Senate, and then those bills would move on to the House. HB 5141, which does some of the same kind of work that allows counties to consolidate what are called absent voter counting boards, so that smaller counties could consolidate and try to speed up some of the counting of some of those absentee ballots. That bill was actually passed both houses, passed the Senate on this Wednesday, and 36-2. So the chances are good. There is a Senate substitute, and so that will have to be concurred in by the House, and then the bills would go to the governor for consideration. So those bills are moving. There is a bill, HB 5543. This is Representative Paquette's bill that provides for a combined application where, as I mentioned before, often you have to apply for each election separately, and this bill would provide for combined elections that are in the same year, so you could apply to be an absentee voter at the same time for multiple elections in a year. Save all the postage of sending out the additional applications. Anyway, that bill has been reported by its original committee, and it is still awaiting action in the House Ways and Means Committee. And then finally, the ballot selfie bill. This is Representative Steve Johnson's bill, HB 4196. State law actually prohibits people from getting their pictures of them taking of them voting. And so people complained. They said, this is we like to get our kids interested in this, and I take one of my kids in, and voting, and we take pictures of it and all that. Well, that was actually illegal. It actually still is illegal. And this is a bill that's been around a couple of times. It is anyway. There was a hearing on the bill earlier this year in the House Elections Committee, and it is still there. Pretty controversial stuff. So those are kind of summary of where the state bills are. As a general observation, whether you are at the state level or the federal level, the elections is probably the most partisan, the most area of contention, whether the contentious issues are based in perception or reality. It is a very difficult place to legislate because everything either is or is perceived as hyper-partisan, and so it's a challenging place to get consensus on legislation in this area. There's a perception that anything that happens in the arena is designed to tilt the playing field to one side or the other, and sometimes that's true. Next slide, please. So there's federal legislation, as you can imagine. This is a brief survey as of last Friday. There were 209 bills introduced in the 2019-20 session to talk about voting. The bill that's probably the farthest along of these is the HEROES Act, which you probably know about because it's got a lot of other provisions in it that affect people with disabilities, especially in funding home and community-based services, funding state and local governments, et cetera. But one provision in that bill, Representative Lowy is the primary sponsor. There is a section that for grants that are given by the federal government and under the Help America Vote Act, current law actually requires a state match, and that can be a barrier, especially with states that have very tight budgets now. And so there is a waiver of the state match in the section of that bill. That bill has passed the House. It is sitting in the Senate, as you probably know. There's likely to be, I would guess there's likely to be some legislation related to additional COVID funding for state and local governments. That, of course, is a huge political issue. It's not clear whether this particular provision will remain in that legislation or not, but it has been passed through the House and is awaiting action in the Senate. The rest of these bills that are listed here, S3529, S3440, S3725, and S3822, are all Democratic bills that do what federal legislation often does in this area. It provides some grant assistance and then put some requirements and some guardrails around that grant assistance. So the two bills that probably have shown where people have shown the most interest, the Klobuchar-Wyden bill S3529, which requires emergency planning, and in the process of that also sets forth a number of other things that that local elections do. And these, remember, most of these bills deal with federal elections. They don't necessarily apply the same standards to state elections for constitutional reasons. But for the election, what they call the Natural Disaster and Emergency Relief Act, for example, which is the Klobuchar-Wyden bill, they have to, for example, they set forth some standards for early voting, mail-in voting, issues about curing signatures. Remember, in absentee ballots, you have to sign the back of your, you have to sign the ballot or the back of the ballot, and then there's a process of matching up your signature with the signature they have on file. And there are some provisions in there about curing signature discrepancies, about timing for when you have to be able to, when they have to send the voting applications and the voting and the ballots out. A lot of the same issues that are being litigated. So those issues are in the Klobuchar-Wyden bill. Generally the same with the Harris bill, S3725, and that, except that broadens beyond emergencies to include aid for federal elections with a bunch of conditions attached. They're similar to the conditions that are set forth in the Klobuchar-Wyden bill. S3529 has 36 co-sponsors. Predictably, 35 of them are Democrats. One is an independent. Probably know who that is. Senator Harris's bill, S3725, has 17 co-sponsors, 16 Democrats, and one independent. These bills are probably guaranteed to gather dust in the Senate in their current form. But if the Senate changes hands and becomes there's a Democratic majority, then that could change. But that is not the way things are right now. Okay, next slide, please. I think that's the end of our formal presentation. Just as a reminder that the message we try to get to people is that you have the right to vote, and you have the right to choose how you vote. Not only where you vote, but also who you vote for, and all those kinds of issues. And this is a fundamental issue of empowerment, helping people with disabilities empower themselves to be part of their, and be not only participants in determining issues that affect them in the future, but also exercising what is really a fundamental community right, and part of, there's probably nothing more about being part of the community than voting. So with that, I think we're ready to take any questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Noah. Our first question comes from an advocate. I'll read it. And in my experience, one of the largest barriers to voting for people with disabilities is their parents. Whether or not they have guardianship, Parents can decide that their quote unquote children are not competent to vote and then prevent them from voting. In my experience, age 21 to 26 educational programs bow to parental pressure and don't work with their students to prepare them to vote and to exercise their right to vote. Likewise, I've seen direct support staff who are discouraged from assisting in voting, if not actually prohibited from assisting. What does MPAS recommend to deal with this?
Well, I have
You have some thoughts now?
I have some thoughts about this. In our current law right now, guardians and parents are not allowed to prevent people with disabilities to vote. There's no law right now that allows guardians to prevent people with disabilities to vote. So if any of that is happening, then you should definitely contact us, and hopefully we'll be able to resolve it.
Let me add a couple things. One is the attitudinal barriers about access to voting are huge, and so part of this is about educating. Part of this is about educating people to, not only on the right to vote, but also just on the importance of it. One thing that there are a couple things that we're doing. One is we developed a curriculum a presentation for high school students and students of transition age that we just finished it. We've actually presented it a couple of times, and we're very interested in talking with transition coordinators, and we understand too that for students in general, the time to talk about sort of civics is 10th grade, and so one of the things to get people interested in, and I think a way to get at this is partly through general education, is to talk about the importance of voting and the power of voting. The tailwind you have with that is that there's pretty broad agreement on how important voting is as a civic activity. I mean, I remember having a conversation with some years ago with the then chair of the Senate Elections Committee, a different person who was no longer there, but talking about areas of agreement on access to voting, and one of them is just how important it is to be part of the process and to and be in that part of the community. So there is, I think, some hope in the sense that there's broad agreement that this is an important activity. There's broader agreement, at least, than there are in other aspects of voting. But that the next step then is to pull people into the voting process, make them feel, give them a chance, give them confidence, give people resources and ways to become empowered, and help them understand that they can do it. The headwind is that I think there are a couple headwinds. One is that sort of there's recent research talking about from the NAACP and from Black PAC, for example, talking about how sort of shaming people into voting. That is, this is your responsibility, and if you don't do it, there's something bad about you. Generally doesn't motivate people, and that's an approach that we've taken for I think we've taken that approach since the beginning of time. Talking about how just informing people what their duty is and giving them making them feel badly if they don't vote generally doesn't motivate people to turn out. So we have to. So some of that research is suggesting that it's important to meet people where they are. The other is that that people get disillusioned. They think that voting doesn't make a difference, and that's having to convince people that voting does make a difference is sometimes a hard go. So I do think that there's some cause for optimism, and that we find those people, teachers especially, we find those people who really are excited about teaching voting and about encouraging voting, and really know how to find students and reach them where they are and say, hey, you should do this, and help and use and writing the coattails of that kind of process to get them there.
I'm also going to piggyback on that.
Yeah.
Kind of like what kind of like Mark was saying about shaming people. I had that experience before where I was sort of like shamed for quote unquote not voting for like their preferred candidate. It's not really a good way to go about things. I have a right to vote for my own decisions, just like anyone else. So if that particular person wants to vote for them, fine. That's totally their right to do so. But if they're trying to call me crazy or kind of wacky for not voting for their preferred candidate, then they're lost. I mean, it's not. I mean, they have to. Like your vote is also to be earned by people
Right.
as well. It's not like necessarily a guarantee that somebody's going to appeal to you directly. So it's good to make your own decisions in that regard. And another point is that I have seen personal experiences of where the reason why people say that voting doesn't matter is that there legitimately hasn't been very many changes going on that that are meeting people's standards. So in terms of actual progress, which I can totally understand, and the way that I kind of like to take it is that if you want to see something like really better, then voting is just like one way of making sure your voice gets heard. And then you can also get involved with, with the grassroots organizing and with other civic engagement as well. Once the elections are over, I don't think that voting enough allows people to really see any needed changes. I think there's a lot of steps involved. It's only just like one way that it's like one way that you can participate. And it's like only one way of participating. There's multiple ways to participate and see real changes needed. So that's how I like to view it.
Thank you. For this question, we're going to flip back to an earlier slide about the election protection hotline, so we can have that number up again. And I'd just like to remind our attendees that you can get a copy of Mark's the MPAS presentation. If you look in the GoToWebinar control panel under the tab that says handouts, it's available as a PDF there. If you have difficulty finding it or it's not working for you, you can always email us after at info@arcmi.org. So the question is the election protection hotline only for disability related access issues?
No.
No, it's for multiple issues. It's really for like if anyone is denied the right to vote. So if they get denied like a provincial ballot, or if someone gets booted out for whatever reason, like if they're really trying to register to vote in another state, for example, and they even show like an out-of-state ID, like driver's license. If it's not really updated, then more likely you're going to get rejected. So that's like an example. But that's not the only one. I mean, there's kind of like some other ones that have occurred where people get moved into different precincts. So we had that happen to a voter in Grosse Pointe Woods, and we're still figuring that one out. And then there are some other ones that from one of my friends who also had a similar incident Detroit, and they were moved without warning. And unfortunately, when they came to their original booth, they got denied. So those are the kind of things where electric protection hotline can really help resolve those complaints. And then therefore the clerks can fix those issues as immediately as possible.
Thank you, Noah. Next question, well, it's actually a story and then a question. 2 years ago, I didn't get my absentee ballot, even though it was sent by the clerk's office. I called the clerk's office and they said that they were having problems with the post office. The clerk did an investigation, and since I didn't have transportation, she drove the ballot out to me. Do voter education efforts inform people how to deal with that problem if the post office doesn't deliver your ballot?
I think that, the kind of problems that people run into on election day, they're just all over the place, and right beforehand. And because this is such a localized process, it's impossible to figure out exactly what kinds of problems are going to come up. The thing that's, I guess I would say there's two general principles that people should follow. One is that the accommodation process is an individualized process, just like under any other Americans with Disabilities Act or Rehabilitation Act kind of process. It should be, the accommodations should be the result of an interactive process between the clerk and the voter. So regardless of what specific problem comes up, there should be a process in place for you to resolve it. And the second principle is that it should be resolved quickly and in favor of you being able to vote, because if you can't vote on election day, that it's almost impossible to restore that right for that election. And so anything that happens should be in favor of, whether it's a provisional vote or something else, it needs to be in favor of making sure that you get a chance to actually cast a ballot, and then figure out the other issues around it later. That's a really good example, though, that particular situation of how the process of requesting a ballot, getting a ballot, sending, getting it back in, and with the really tight timelines, sort of clashing against what the post office does, it makes this a really difficult kind of thing. It makes it just a really difficult thing. So that it's almost like we have a process that was designed for a different time period, and we're trying to figure out exactly how to make it work in the 21st century.
Yeah, hopefully reform would also be, kind of like in the future, be adding more voting centers and, ballot drop boxes. That would be really, would really kind of increase the availability for people who don't really have as much time to vote to actually send their ballots there, especially if there's not really like a post office available. So that's one thing that I was interacting with one of the voting specialists in Colorado. It's not necessarily a perfect system because there are still some accessibility bugs within it, but it's a lot better than not having a post office at all. And if you have trouble sending that over, so that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Next question. I heard from my local clerk that they're not able to put the accessible voting machines in a training mode, so the poll workers don't have an opportunity for that hands-on training. Is that something that's true across the state?
That sounds wrong to me. I don't. Do you know for sure?
Well, I know that Lansing had their own training. That's more localized. So really, I think it's more of a local problem. If they're not really allowing any kind of training, then I think that's kind of like a local issue.
It's also a really good I mean, it's a good kind of issue to resolve before the election, if you know about it beforehand. And so if a clerk is saying we can't train on these things for one reason or another, that's something that we could contact the Bureau of Elections about, and say, you need to fix this. And they've been pretty good about responding to those kinds of individual issues when they can. Yeah, the more advanced notice before an election, though, the better to fix that problem. We've certainly been involved with trainings with clerks using the machines, and there doesn't seem to be an issue.
Thank you. We had one of our attendees let us know that their clerk has been there and trained community members on accessing or on using the accessible voting machines.
Right, and if nothing else, use them in an election. Our local clerk had a contest and bought lunch for the precinct that had the highest percentage of people who used the accessible voting machines, and that meant that they had something like 70% of the voters in a primary election actually used the accessible voting machines, people with and without disabilities, and that was a great opportunity to train. So that I think for it just, with a little creativity, you can get training on these things.
Next question is about electronic voting. As citizens, we submit our taxes electronically every year, and it has our bank routing information and social security numbers. Why, or has there been any discussion about making a similarly secure system to make electronic voting possible?
Yep. In fact, Alaska for a number of years had electronic voting. I think they started it up in 2012 and went to, I think, all the way up to 2018 where they suspended it. West Virginia recently adopted an app where they're giving people opportunities to cast ballots electronically. And there are a couple of private companies that have put together, that have voting software that allow people to receive and cast electronic ballots. The primary issue with it is very strong opposition, vocal opposition from the election security community that once you start casting ballots electronically, the voting records are subject to getting hacked and corrupted. So there's a National Academy of Sciences report that came out, I think, in 2018 that summarized some of the opinion about it and concluded that there was no way to keep that using current technology, there was no way to keep an election secure if you open it up to electronic voting. It seems odd given how much information, not only financial information we share, but also health information. It seems odd to me that we can't secure voting, but that is the argument, and the election security, individuals and organizations, and there are a number of them in Michigan, are pretty vocal about the fact that this is a dangerous thing. And you find, I think, policy-wise, that the trend is actually going in the opposite direction toward more use of paper ballots, which of course are not fully accessible for security reasons, and that's the primary discussion.
Thank you. Our next question is, the person is looking for slides or resources they can use to promote voter registration and voting within their community. So I again posted the link in the chat for the voting access video that we looked at. What else do you suggest?
Noah probably can answer this better than me, but there are many organizations that are promoting voter registration and voting that are not specific to people with disabilities. Rock the Vote, the Go Voter Initiative from AAPD, their Legal Women Voters has campaigns. So these are campaign and a number of like NAACP, Black PAC, number of specific organizations that are targeted at particular groups of people of all ages. Noah, can you think of one or two really good resources that you've run into that provide sort of educational materials on voter registration and voting?
Yeah, I mean, there is the Secretary of State website that does kind of list the steps on what to do and what kind of like materials to bring. I do agree with you on the League of Women Voters, and also you don't really have to look directly at the actual websites. You can also, like, if you're kind of like joining like some kind of protest, for example, and they have a voter registration drive, then basically you kind of list out your entire like first and last name, your residence, your zip code, and then which county that they are living in, and if you want to start registering that way. So there is a little bit of that, and I think the League of Women Voters is probably the best one. But then for the Secretary of State website, there's kind of like a list of materials that you would need, and just so you know, we're technically supposed to be like a non-strict voter ID state, but most people are probably going to be looking for kind of like identification. So that's just another thing to point out.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last, sorry, I have a resource to share. That National Disability Voter Registration Week is July 13th through 17th. And then our last question has to do with parents who have, okay, so this goes back to the earlier question from the advocate that parents can be a barrier. How can a parent who has a child with a more profound disability include them in the voting process?
There are two parts. One is to communicate with them about the process of registering and kind of demystifying it, I think, a little bit. It's you using the communication strategies and methods that you use with a person to communicate information. Demystifying the process. We found that with a lot of young people, it's not just young people with disabilities. It's anybody. It is a mysterious process to them about how you register and vote. And old people like me take for granted that that we just do this, and it's not obvious to everyone. So that's part of it. The other is, through person-centered planning, you identify what a person's interests, who their friends are, who they want, their desires, their wishes, their direction, and a lot of the same strategies that you would employ to ensure that people get a chance to direct their own lives can include voting. It's not just information about how to go about voting, but also information about how to become educated and how to make choices about how to think through and make choices about things. You communicate that to the same extent about that with the same ways that you communicate about any other kinds of issues that affect a person's community and affects their how they live their life.
Yeah, one thing also is that, I think another really interesting reform that I do want to see is actually have like the whole idea of voting like earlier than 10th grade. I mean, I learned about civics, about the Constitution when I was probably in like 5th grade or so, which is, definitely got me more politically educated about that. So if they use that for kind of like voting and kind of like how um, people would want to look at that in the future, then I think that would get people more galvanized, and it wouldn't be as it wouldn't be as like demystifying, like mystifying as and mysterious like when you're like literally above the age of 18. That's unacceptable.
All right, well, our time is up for today. Thank you so much to our presenters, Mark McWilliams and Noah Walker.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for attending this week's Disability Policy Webinar Series presented by the ARC Michigan. Come back next week, Friday, June 19th, when you'll be joined by Belinda Hawks, the Director of the Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities Administration at the Department of Health and Human Services, and Sarah Esty, Senior Deputy Director for Policy and Planning at MDHHS. They will let us know how services are being affected both now and in the future by the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.